Thank you for tuning in to the Voice of the Victim podcast. We discuss a lot of sad and potentially triggering things on this show. We try to be as sensitive and cautious as possible, but if you are sensitive to things involving abuse and may be triggered, please think twice before listening to our show. Welcome to the Voice of the Victim podcast. I'm Rosie.
And I'm Ryan. How are you doing tonight, Rosie?
I'm doing okay. How about you, Ryan?
I'm doing pretty well. We had a very interesting discussion with Dr. Kelly Palfy that we're excited to share with you. Obviously, this is our first time ever including video with an entire podcast episode, so it's a little weird. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about it?
I don't like it, but I'm trying to like it.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be a regular thing. But we're giving it a try because the rest of this podcast was already in video form, and we figured we'd give it a shot. So, do you have anything else to say before we jump into the episode?
I hope everybody's enjoying their summer. Hope everyone has some fun summer plans. I can't believe that it's almost July already.
I know. This whole year has just gone by like that. But you're going paddleboarding today, so that's very exciting.
I can barely look at the camera.
I know. I'm used to being on camera all the time because I have a YouTube channel, but she is not. I did want to preface this interview with the fact that we had a rough start with some technical difficulties, and I don't know about Rosie, but I was pretty nervous talking to someone who's a professional and obviously a lot smarter than us in a lot of ways. So I was a little intimidated and nervous at first, but by the end, we were having a really, really nice discussion. And yeah, I think you'll all find it very interesting. So let's jump into this. Today we're talking to Dr. Kelly Palfy, and she's a psychologist and works especially with male victims of sexual abuse. So do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Okay, yes, thank you, Ryan. Thanks for having me on here today. I'm Dr. Kelly Palfy. I'm a former RCMP officer, and I am a registered psychologist. And like you mentioned, I do specialize in male survivors of sexual abuse. It was birthed sort of by my own, shall we say, awakening process of learning about the magnitude of the problem. So I was being trained to be a subject matter expert for the RCMP major crimes. And I realized it was a very humbling experience to learn that I was considered the expert and I had no information about this. I had no idea about it. So I thought, well, if I'm the expert and I don't know anything, that's probably how most people operate, is in that same sort of blind spot, I would say. You know, kind of just that process of having my eyes opened is what made me take an interest in the topic.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because when we were watching that video you sent us about how popular male rape jokes are in the media, you know, even though we talk about this every week, we both were shocked by how it is so normalized that it was something we both have seen those jokes and not thought anything of it either. So we see how easy that is.
Yeah, and Ryan, I would have been just as guilty, in fact, maybe even perpetrating those jokes and threats like we see in the videos, right? I had heard pro hockey player Sheldon Kennedy talk about his abuse and why he didn't talk about it. And he had lots of reasons, but one of the things he said was that he felt like he was living a double life. And at the time, I was a police lady and I was getting bullied. And it was like, I get that little piece, like that living a double life where you're putting on this total front for everybody else. So, you know, I guess once you've gone through your own worst nightmare or whatever, you know, you can kind of relate a little bit better to other people who are victims. And yeah, it just kind of, you know, because I did consider myself sort of masculine, I guess would be the term, because I was a police lady. I was tough, you know, and I mean, the RCMP broke me with the bullying and stuff like that. And then you realize that we do all have a breaking point, you know, and kind of just this awareness, like I said, that, wow, like I had been a prison guard and I'd wondered why there were so many men in prison. And then all of a sudden, I mean, I know that a lot of most male victims don't wind up in prison, but it certainly made sense to me why the ones that were turning to alcohol and drugs and stuff like that for their coping mechanisms, how they ended up there, right? Especially if their abuse happened when they were really young.
Yeah, that's another thing that stood out to me when I heard you talking is how, especially in schools, when there's kids that are having trouble with learning or they're looked at as troubled students, there's usually a deeper cause, and people are only seeing the symptoms. They're not seeing what the root cause is, and they're kind of labeled because of that, even though, you know, they're experiencing trauma or it's the result of trauma.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's often misdiagnosed, is what we say. I had sent you a couple videos to watch, which you just referred to, right? Just shocking when you, like, I found them really hard to watch, right? I found them like disturbing to watch when you just see the number of high profile actors and popular movies where they're totally just making fun of male rape and just making fun of male vulnerability, period, right? Like the one video, sexual assault of men played for laughs, and then the second one was why rape is seriously hilarious. And both of them like really offended me to watch, and I'm not even a male survivor.
Yeah, especially that rape is hilarious one was really difficult to watch because just seeing the pain in his face while he was talking. And we'll definitely link those below.
Right.
Super powerful videos. The only thing I don't love about them is, again, like when you think about, like, say, the straight heterosexual male, you know, there's always this implication, or often this implication, that if you're a male victim, you know, there's some homosexuality associated to that, or, you know, if their body responded, they might think that way. Or just the one video about all the incidents on TV, he has a disclaimer at the end saying that it's in support of the queer population in the prison system. Well, what about the straight population too, right?
I appreciate in that part, though, that he did focus the blame on rapists. It has nothing to do with the victim or who they are. It's all about the terrible people that are the rapists and that perpetrate these crimes against them.
You know, the media makes any sort of male victim as off as being pathetic, and, you know, it's often portrayed, for example, as, you know, like one video said, like, you got the stereotypical steroided out black guy perpetrating against some effeminate white guy who's terrorized and traumatized as the white dumb guards watch, you know, and allow it to happen. And I was just like, I mean, that's so awful on so many levels, right? If you think about a male victim, how would they ever want to come forward if they thought that law enforcement was okay with this, for one thing, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. When they basically are painting these men, these victims, as weak and as all these things that men don't aspire to be, that's what they're painting these victims as, when it has nothing to do with their character, like we were just saying. It's all about that they were taken advantage of.
Yeah, in that video that we watched, the rape is seriously hilarious. I never really got that aspect before. Obviously, being raped by a teacher is something, it's terrible. It's a terrible act. And the way that the man talked about how this was supposed to be the best time of his life because all of his peers were telling him that this was a good thing. So he was stuffing down the emotion, but you could see with his eyes how much pain he was in. It was really eye-opening to see how the male perspective of that, whereas as an adult female, I feel terrible, but to see his perspective of how he's feeling with people around him judging him so fiercely.
Really confusing emotions.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Because everybody's telling him he should feel one thing or whatever, that, you know, he should have enjoyed it, right? And I mean, he's already telling himself that, right? And he's trying to convince himself that, possibly, right? Because it's too terrorizing to face the reality and their own sense of responsibility or victimness or willingness or whatever you want to, like, whatever aspect they're looking at. Just, yeah, that video is so powerful.
And like you mentioned in another interview, their body may have a positive response to what's happening. So that further confuses them because they're like, well, my body likes this, so this must be fine.
And of course, the perpetrators will use that against them, right? As if, you know, like, look, you like this kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a common thing in abuse. I appreciated when you're talking about kind of the themes of your book, which, well, I mentioned you have a book, Men Too.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, oh, there you go. Nice. You had mentioned, you're trying to educate young people and all men, especially, just to be aware of the signs of abuse and what could be happening to them. Because if they have experienced it, they might not even realize it because of those confusing emotions. And
absolutely. Because of gender biases too, right? Like, men are always supposed to be able to protect themselves. Men are always supposed to enjoy sex or want sex, They're always supposed to be ready and willing no matter who the participant is, right? Or aggressor is.
Yeah. And you talked about even professionals have a harder time identifying those signs in men than in females.
Absolutely. And I mean, yeah, professionals too. And I mean, it's just everywhere, right? Like, you would never see a movie portraying, female rape as a threat and it be socially acceptable, right? One of those movies in the clip, right? This idea of you're going to get raped by this monster and they're going to use tools and all this stuff and it's going to be particularly painful. You would never see a show advocating that against a woman. Mm-hmm. So why is it okay to say that about a man, right?
Right. And playing it off as a joke. Yeah. And that plays into the whole theme of it being normalized in media. And, like we mentioned at the beginning, we were both shocked by how unfazed we were by those jokes at first, mm-hmm. until it started talking about the double standard. Mm-hmm. And if it was about a woman, we would have been offended. But mm-hmm. at first, before really thinking about it, it just felt normal to us. So,
right.
Yeah, it's definitely something that, there was no shortage of examples in mainstream media where it's played off as a joke. Mm-hmm. You talked about inspiring men to seek help. You made it clear that your book isn't a replacement for therapy or something like that. You want to inspire people to seek help when they recognize that these things may have happened to them.
Absolutely.
And you work with victims a lot and survivors.
I do, yes.
Do you have advice for people who maybe have experienced these things and they just can't bring themselves to talk about it or can't bring themselves to seek out help?
Right. Well, there are all kinds of self-help books that can be very helpful, right? Like books on trauma and understanding the brain. And, my book obviously is meant to do a bit of that as well. There are anonymous places where you can get supports too. The websites malesurvivor.org and 1 in 6 have lots of resources there where male survivors can go and either participate in a chat anonymously or get some reading that might be helpful or speak anonymously to a counselor or something like that.
Okay. Obviously, we're very grassroots, very person-to-person people, and we have talked to a lot of people who have been going through something like this. Not men in particular, because it's rare to find a man that's willing to come forward. And the statistic, I guess, is a lot lower, but I wonder how many people just don't feel comfortable coming forward.
Actually, I'm gonna challenge you on that. It is not that hard to find men that are wanting to talk about it, but we have to make it okay for them to talk about it. I'm finding that men are more than willing to talk about it. Like, at least to say, yeah, that was me, or yeah, I was victimized, or oh, that happened to me, or they'll well up and tell me, thank you very much for what you do, and where can I get a copy of your book, kind of thing. So I think more and more men are willing to come forward and get help, but research shows that men won't talk about things that they don't hear other men talking about. So it's really important, like even just what you're doing, opening up those conversations, making this an okay subject of conversation, just that, hey, we support men who want to be supported too.
Wow, that's really interesting.
I think one thing that might be important to talk about is just women's role in all this. And I might even address that to your partner. We both just talked about how, we were kind of shocked at how previously maybe we weren't aware of this, like just sort of women's role in society and how we perpetuate these sort of attitudes. I think that's a really interesting subject, right? Definitely me as a former police officer, being tough and stuff. I used to kind of, I don't know how you'd word it, but just like I used to take pleasure in emasculating men, I guess you'd say. Yeah, ugh, that's gross to say out loud, but until and as a therapist, obviously I've even redefined my definition of courage, right? Like I think anybody who comes forward, it takes courage to do that, right? And any man who allows himself to be vulnerable, it takes incredible courage. Most of us tough guys, we don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd say, at least from my perspective, there's definitely a fear for me to speak out about anything I might be going through because, there is such a narrative going around that men just have it easy and,
And, yeah. Men don't care. Men don't feel.
yeah.
Right.
And that there's just inherited privilege with being a man and they don't experience the same kind of things that women do. So it's nice to see a woman like yourself talking about these things and being a support to the men that have gone through these things. And I just think it's really important. Mm-hmm. And it means a lot more coming from a woman who has worked with these people. And like you said, when you were on the force, you made the same kind of jokes or you took pleasure in that same kind of thing. So it's not like the people who perpetuate that narrative are bad people. It's just, that's the narrative that they're being fed right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to treat everyone with respect, no matter what you may perceive about them at first.
I just find it so shocking in today's culture of, inclusivity and stuff like that. There's still such little room for men to be victims, right? Like that's just gross, right? And I mean, a lot of the times we're not necessarily talking about adult men. We're talking about little boys who've been victimized and who've never had, either the language or the safety or the opportunity to come forward, and then they become adults and they, have the language, have the understanding that what happened to them was abuse. And then they're bombarded with this in the media, right? Because lots of times, this abuse will be happening as they're a young child and they don't understand that it was abuse or the sexual nature of it, or they can't put language to it, or they're just in a position where they're helpless, hopeless to stop it because it's a bio parent or something like that. And then you become an adult and, you finally have the language and the freedom from your parents or whatever to talk about it. But everybody keeps telling you, I doubt that happened, as if that would happen, right? It's just, but yet if a young girl came forward and said she was sexually abused by her parents, everybody would be like, oh my gosh, that's so horrible, which it is. Absolutely it is. But such a double standard.
Yeah, it's really well said. Yeah, I think that's kind of the key, especially with young boys. Well, first of all, educating them on what to look for and also taking the shame away from it of being a victim. Like there's nothing shameful. It's not your fault. Mm-hmm. And just knowing that it's okay to come talk to an adult about something that may be happening to them and know that they won't be judged. They won't be shamed and that it's a safe space to come forward.
Mm-hmm. It just seems, unfortunately, that because of all the media and the subtle jokes that we see, even in the cartoons, which was shocking to me,
SpongeBob,
that it seems like children, male or female, they're growing up with the expectation that male rape or any type of molestation or abuse is normal or joked about. It's not a serious thing compared to when it's done to females. So it'll take a lot of extra care.
I do think that it's coming from a place like the people that will be perpetuating like messages like this, like these are possibly straight, white or whatever male that, that are accomplished that have no threat of this happening to them. Right. They're adults and they're safe unless they do something horrendous that puts them in jail. Right.
Yeah. So that's where it's interesting that Terry Crews came forward because that's someone, when you look at him, he's this big muscular guy. You'd think there's no risk to him. He can defend himself. And yet he was still.
That was very interesting.
Someone assaulted him and tried to dominate him and take away his power.
Yeah. You're under my control now, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And yet when you look at him, you would think, oh, he doesn't have to worry about that.
Well, and then after he did come out so publicly to have some bullying, the response back towards it was mind-blowing.
Yeah, 50 Cent memed it and made it into a joke.
Yeah, he's one of my heroes, honestly, because, he could have brushed it off as the guy was drunk or whatever. He could have minimized it in his own mind, but yet he chose to be an advocate for men because he well, and who knows, maybe he's had worse experiences than that when he was a youth, and this is what he's capable of talking about. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I did another interview a while ago I don't know if he even ever posted it, and I can't remember who it was, but he started off talking about, a minor incident in his adulthood, and then he ended up like almost in tears talking about 2 other incidents that happened to him as an adult too. And he even said to me, I didn't plan to talk about that stuff, so I don't know if he'll even post that video.
Wow. Do you find that a lot, where the longer you talk to someone and the more comfortable they get with you, the more they're willing to open up about that they weren't at first?
Absolutely. Like, I had one police client who, like, I put right on my intake questionnaire, and I recommend any psychologist do that, were you sexually abused? And he ticked off yes. And I covered that with him. I said, oh, you do know that that's my area of specialization? He said, yeah, but we're never talking about it. Like, it's I don't even think about it. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't affect my life. And when we got digging in, I'm like, maybe it does. Mm-hmm. All these themes that you have about yourself not being good enough and never coming into yourself and never finding your own niche and stuff like that, they all go back to this idea that, I don't know, I just see it as a big root of his own self-hatred, lack of sense of self-esteem, self-worth, that coupled with a couple of things that happened with his father, just a really bad combination. Wow,
that's interesting. Well, and even, the different vices that people may have, like drug abuse and alcoholism, I saw you talking about this too, where people will look at those individuals that have a drug problem or alcohol problem or any kind of addiction and just assume, they're a lost cause or a bad person or whatever, when there could be so much trauma underneath that they're just trying to cope with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they would get bombarded with trauma triggers and memories and emotions and stuff. And they turn to substances because they need a break from it. Just like you and I would need a break from somebody continually yelling in our face, right?
Yeah.
Be like, I'll close myself in the car and drive away if I have to, if you don't stop yelling, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you think about all the people who go to prison for drug-related crimes. Absolutely. That may have already been victims, and then they're going to be re-victimized again.
I am convinced that our prisons are full of male survivors. Honestly, you would never convince me otherwise. I mean, I'm not saying everyone, but I would guess 75% or more of the prison population was probably abused. Well, you've seen that Compassion Prison Circle, right? Have you seen that video?
No.
Mm-mm. It's this amazing prison project where they have like a social worker organizing it, and all the inmates are standing around in this huge circle in the yard, and she's in the middle or off to the side or whatever with this loudspeaker, and she's saying, take one step forward if somebody hit you when you were a child. Take one step forward if somebody called you a loser. Take one step forward if someone hit you with an object. Take one step forward if someone ever called you whatever, and you got all these inmates, and they say, take one step forward if you're sexually abused. And then they interview all these guys afterwards, and they kind of say, well, there was one I didn't step forward on that I should have or could have, But like by the end of it, they're all this tight group of inmates that are just sobbing because of their own recognition of how they got to where they were, basically, right? Like, rather than beating themselves up or posturing, they're kind of seeing themselves as, child victims of abuse.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, super powerful.
I'll look it up and link it when we in the show notes when we get it up. But that's sad that even while seeing all their comrades stepping forward, that they still didn't feel comfortable with all the questions. Like there were still things they didn't step forward for.
Some did, but some didn't.
Just shows how strong that stigma is.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. They're basically doing, it's called the ACEs test, Adverse Childhood Experiences. So they're kind of just, they've kind of blown that up into a grander scale. I don't know how many questions it is, but oh my gosh. Yeah, it's powerful.
Wow. I got to give credit to Justin from the Generation Y podcast when a really long time ago, they did this episode about the war on drugs, and he's the one who really put the seed in my head about all these people who are addicted to drugs. Justin and Aaron were talking about, but how usually it's a coping mechanism that gets them started on it. Like they're trying to deal with some kind of trauma, and then they get labeled and they get thrown into that situation where instead of rehabilitating them or something like that, they just take any possibility of that away. And then they don't get better for it. When they get out of prison, a lot of people are worse than before.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. When I was doing my PhD, I had a potential job offer by a psychologist in the US, and I wanted to take him up on it. He actually ended up in a very serious car accident, and I believe that's what led to his retirement. It wasn't a car accident, he got ran over. But anyways, he used to advocate, and I think he still does a tiny bit of this work, but he was going into the prison systems and advocating for, like, largely for male survivors who had committed violent crimes, right? Like, you know, he'd go do a huge background search on their history and say, you know, Your Honor, this kid was sexually abused by his father from the age of 4 till 11, like, you know, and you know, at the age of 17, he did a robbery, right? Like, well, can we cut this kid some slack and keep him alive? Like, he's not getting these guys out of prison, but he was at least keeping them from being put to death, right? So just the fact that there's, you know, enough business that would keep him and several other psychologists employed advocating for male survivors was sad, honestly.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's one of the things that really grabbed our interest when we first started this podcast, is talking about the case of Cody Posey, if you're familiar with him.
Is that the one that killed his parents, or?
Yeah. And his parents had been sexually abusing him his whole life. And I mean, the public response to him was very, very kind. But it just really opened my eyes on how much sexual abuse as a child can mess someone up, because that was an act to escape from abuse, you know?
Absolutely. Right. And, you know, like, the one thing that really touches my heart right now is, I don't know, where are you located? You're in the US?
Yeah, we're in Minnesota.
So you probably wouldn't know about this, but in Canada up here, we just had, like, you know, started in the 1600s up until the late 1900s, we had these residential schools where First Nations children were being taken from their homes and placed in these schools. And some of them came from bad situations, but some of them came from decent situations and went to worse. And, you know, not all of them, but some of them were sexually abused in these schools. And so they just found this mass grave of a couple hundred kids. And I mean, we don't know the cause of their death yet, but we do know, like, you know, through rumors and through research and through stories and whatever, that a lot of these children were very, very heavily victimized and sexually abused, and some of them even killed in these residential schools. And when we look at the First Nations population now, like some of the reserves are okay, but a lot of them are a frickin' mess, right? Like, lots of sexual abuse, lots of violence, lots of alcoholism, lots of drugs, lots of just people that don't get out of there, and, you know, victims having babies that get abused, right? And it's, you know, it just breaks my heart when you think about, like, the root of a lot of this is sexual abuse. Right? Sexual abuse. These kids were never taught proper educations. They were never given a chance to be successful. They probably never learned how to be regulated emotionally. You know, if a child doesn't learn how to read by grade 3, the chances of them going to prison as an adult are very high.
Really?
Wow.
Right. And so you think about these kids that were in schools like this, where they've been removed from their families. These are kids that are not allowed to speak their language, not allowed to see their families. Many of them being sexually abused and tortured and beaten and expected to learn English and want to, you know, succeed in our world.
Yeah. Even their names were stripped. I remember that story just came out a few weeks ago, right?
Yeah. It just infuriates me, you know, to hear, like, people say, well, why don't they get over it? You know, it's like, are you kidding me? If that happened to you in elementary school and high school, could you be over it right now?
Right.
Oh, no kidding. How did they end up in that situation again? They were taken from the...
Came out a few weeks ago when we were in Colorado. The Native American people were taken from their families to be...
It was very popular in the 1800s and 1900s. You know, they kind of the government took the approach that the First Nations people were uncivilized and we had to civilize them, right? And, you know, I mean, white men introduced alcohol to them, so, you know, they did not have a biological predisposition to metabolize alcohol, and, you know, it didn't serve their society very well to have been introduced to alcohol. So there were a lot of problems in some of the society, but obviously not all of them got involved with being alcohol consumers. And there were some bad situations where children might have needed apprehended, but certainly not their entire culture. We didn't need to decimate their culture.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
I'm sorry, I got confused when you were talking about being so recent because I remember running across stories about stuff like that when we were researching Ravenscraig and the MK Ultra stuff and how there were just these mass graves outside nearby.
They just discovered one here in Canada and they don't really know what happened yet, but yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, can't imagine.
It's pretty crazy when you think about it on a grand scheme of things, how much of it goes on in society, right?
Yeah. It really is.
How much we don't know about.
Yeah. You know, another thing that kind of, you know, from a bigger perspective, it kind of breaks my heart when you think about everything God would see, right?
Ugh.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, stuff's coming out all the time, and it's usually stuff that had been kept secret for years, if not decades. So just to think about all the things that we don't know about, it's overwhelming because you want to give each story the time of day and learn about it, but there's so much of it. It's bringing it back to boys and men and sexual abuse. The fact that it is so easily joked about and so downplayed makes it even more secretive, I guess, or I can't think of the right word, but wow. Well, thank you for sharing that insight. That's a lot
Ryan,
to think about.
It sounds like you picked up a copy of my book. I'm curious what your thoughts were on it.
I haven't read it yet.
No, missed a lot of
No, I was just listening to you talk about it. She's the one who reads. So
you can listen to it on Audible.
Oh, yes, that is what I do. Speaking of your book, do you want to talk about it and tell our listeners about it?
Yeah, sure. So my book is called Men Too, Unspoken Truths About Male Sexual Abuse. So I was kind of doing a bit of a, play on the Me Too movement, just trying to say, hey, don't forget about the men, Like I said, it got birthed from from my awareness of, I was considered the expert and I didn't know anything. So I wanted to know, okay, well, I know one or two people's reasons for why they didn't report. There's got to be more reasons. So I conducted my doctoral research examining why boys and men don't typically come forward. And I don't know, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I did love doing interviewing, and then I had already done my master's and my PhD. So I was fascinated by this topic, and I had a very rich data source. And so I got some pretty deep stories from guys, and it's not graphic detail. It's, there's a tiny bit of graphic detail in the book, but not a lot, only to explain that sexual abuse comes in all shapes and sizes, right? Mm-hmm. Basically, it's meant as a psychoeducational mechanism for creating awareness in the general public, but even more so meant to support male survivors themselves. So one other person that I did a podcast with, he'd read my book and he said, your book put words to what I previously didn't understand. And that was my whole goal. I wanted to help men to debunk the myths and to have understanding of how they got in that situation, the understanding of the grooming process and the confusion and all this stuff to sort of validate their realities and to help them process their traumatic, not in a therapeutic sense, but just, cognitively, and encourage them to get help, right? That, there is professional help out there that could be beneficial. So that's my book. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Chapters.
Yeah, it's a really important book. I remember you talking about how you put it into easily understandable terms, and like you were just talking about the person who you helped him understand things that he couldn't put into words before. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to it.
Mm-hmm. And I love how you did the play on the Me Too movement. I think that's it's such clever. A smart idea. It's really, really clever.
Thank you.
Yeah, people will know exactly what it's about when just looking at the cover.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I appreciate the publicity. And, like I say, men don't typically talk about things that they don't hear other men talking about. So I think it's valuable what you're doing, and it's important what you're doing. And I hope you have a wide audience. I had no way of seeing what kind of an audience you have. So I hope you have a wide audience for this.
It's definitely predominantly women, but we do have a decent amount of men too listening. So.
Okay, that's okay. Women need to understand this too.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say, I feel like this is the best freaking kept secret out there, honestly. No one wants to talk about it, least of all the victims themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're living proof of that right now because of what we talked about at the beginning. It's something as much time as we spend focused on these things, it's something we really hadn't thought that much about.
Right. It's just been so normalized. And we've grown up with it. It's been literally right there in the front of us. the whole time.
And, you know, I am friends with another psychologist who is Persian, and she was telling me it is just so predominant in the Persian culture. And I believe in the Indian culture it is as well. Like, you know, you think like soldiers coming back from Afghanistan, they're traumatized by war. Well, I work with military vets. They are traumatized by witnessing the male sexual abuse that goes on in the Afghan military just as much as they are about seeing their buddies blown up. They are just as traumatized from being ordered not to help, because in the Afghan military, there is this unspoken structure where if you're the smallest boy in the ranks, you get pulled out and used by the upper echelon. And a lot of these men are killing themselves instead of being victimized. It's terrible. So they sign up not knowing that this is part of it, or maybe thinking it won't happen to them, or they're desperate to feed their families and need a job and wind up being raped and end up begging the Canadian and US military to help, and they've been ordered not to because that's not part of why they're there. So it's just horrible. They're telling me that, you know, in the morning they would wake up and they would see the bodies of the Afghan soldiers who had killed themselves. It's just brutal. It's everywhere.
Wow. I had no idea about that.
Neither did I, honestly. It's part of why I like to talk about it, because I was considered the expert, and I still learn so much every time I do a podcast or every time I talk to somebody else, you know?
That's why I'm glad we could talk to you, because you never know where a conversation is going to go with people. And
Absolutely.
just, I've learned a lot from talking to you. Obviously, you know, in my opinion, you're way smarter than us. We're just a couple of dumb kids that make a podcast and tell stories and talk about personal experiences.
You know how you can change the world, Ryan. Don't minimize your contributions. And you're just getting started. I probably got 30 years on both of you. I wish I knew then what I know now. And it's, you know, I wish you could. Well, it's great what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Isn't that the way it goes? I wish we had this knowledge before.
What you just said is exactly why I got into this, because I was supposed to be the expert, and I was like, holy crap, I know nothing about this.
Wow. That should give hope to everyone listening, though, even if they've never heard about this stuff before, that hopefully the more we talk about this, the more we can make a positive change. And especially with the new generation coming up, with parents being aware of this and instilling it in their children.
Like you mentioned in the beginning, Ryan, like the misdiagnosis of boys in school, that is huge. Parents wondering. One of the most blogs that I got the most response from was a blog that I had put about, something like, do you wonder why Johnny went astray, right? And it was like so many views on that blog, which was just like, you did everything right as a parent, yet he still became a drug addict. Well, why is that? Maybe you didn't do anything wrong. Maybe you just didn't know that somebody else abused him, right?
Yeah, that's why it's so important that what you're doing and that people just keep talking about this and learning about it. We're not parents, so I don't have any experience, but personally, I believe that it's okay to talk to children and tell them what's not okay to be done to them. Like,
absolutely.
You don't have to get into graphic detail, but they can know what's not okay.
Yeah.
And that it's okay to talk about it.
Absolutely, Ryan. And a lot of parents struggle to have those conversations. And myself and another psychologist here in town have just created a book series. It's not out yet. We're still in the illustration phase, but it's called Creating Safer Spaces. So it's books that adults can read to children, having those difficult conversations, like an introduction to be able to, like, how do we talk about this? So just read the story about a therapy dog and why the kid went to therapy, or read the story about a boy who got a job from a man down the street helping with the puppies and ended up being molested, and what he did about it, and the fact that he's okay, and the bad guy went to jail, and then our third one is about human trafficking.
Wow. That's great. I'm excited about that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'll put you on my list of people to let know when it comes out.
Yes, please. It's nice to know that professionals are working on something like that is easily digestible for kids and appropriate for their age.
Absolutely. But don't minimize your own contribution, right? Like nobody knows about my book unless people like you talk about it. So I appreciate that you have.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being here with us and for sharing your insight and stories. And is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think that's wonderful. I think probably people will be getting bored if we keep talking too long.
All right. Sounds good.
How did you guys get started?
Well, I was a victim of sexual abuse as an early teenager.
Right.
And when we got married, it took Ryan a long time to kind of figure out what that meant
Yeah.
and how that impacted me.
Yeah.
Because it was by a man that was 7 years older than me, and it was hard.
Yeah.
It was hard to figure out, and it was
early teen, and he'd be an adult.
Yeah.
Yep, he was in his 20s, and I was about 14. So it was a tough one because it was mostly statutory and a lot of manipulation, and the way it was found out was really messy. And so it just once he figured it out and wanted to help me have a platform to talk about it, we decided that we were going to do this. Without me sharing my story at first. I was like, wait.
Yeah, she didn't share it till episode 18.
But eventually I shared it, and we've just been going off from there. Now we have a platform for other people that are abused if they want to tell it publicly in their own voice, or they write it in and then we read it for them. So,
Wow. That's cool.
Quite a few listener stories. But it was...
But no men have done it
No,
yet.
not yet. Well, and when we first started, I didn't understand statutory rape because we were friends at the time she went through her abuse, and in our friend group there were a lot of other people that were our peers that were making fun of her behind her back, calling her like slutty and skanky and everything,
Jailbait.
and jailbait, and kind of putting equal blame on her between her and the predator. And so
that's gross.
So when we started this podcast, it was kind of a learning experience for me to wrap my head around what she had gone through and why it was so serious. And that's how we got into this.
Well, that's impressive. You have that many listeners. I wish you guys success because it's super important what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. And thanks for being on.
My pleasure.
I'll definitely be listening to your book.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Best of luck. Let me know if you ever want me back.
Will do. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. Well, thank you for listening. Do you have anything else to say before we go, Rosie?
No, I'm glad that Dr. Pelfy came on. I think that what you said in our intro about at first it was a little like, what do we say? What do we say? But then at the end, it turned out nice and smooth.
Well, yeah. And of course, that's what editing is for, right? But before we go, we want to share a review from one of our listeners. This is from North End of Pyramid Lake on Apple Podcasts, and it's entitled Heal How You Want to Heal. So, Rosie, do you want to read that?
Yeah, it says, I listened to Jade's story and I want to write you guys a great review because I love VOV podcast, but her story left me speechless. Listening to her cry her way through it broke my heart for her, the saddest truth I've ever heard. Jade telling her story is proof of how important VOV is. Never stop. You two are really doing a good thing. Happy anniversary, by the way.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Sometimes it's hard to remember that how important our show is because we're always wondering like if we're doing a good job and stuff. So getting reviews like this really helps us keep going. And even, what Dr. Puffy said at the end of our interview really meant a lot to us. So we're going to keep doing the best we can. Of course, if you want to help support us and help us keep making this show as long as possible, you can always support us on Patreon. But just sharing the show with your friends and tuning in every week, it really helps out a lot. So thank you all for doing that. We appreciate each and every one of you. And I think that's it.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right. So thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.
Welcome to the Voice of the Victim podcast. Wait, you do that now, don't you?
Oh, yeah.